Howdy of you delicious people, I'm here today to review Reaper, Season 1, Episodes 1 and Dos. So, going into this show, I really just quickly got interested in this show. Like, going from, watching it originally when it was on this thing called the television, its original airing, I watched from, pilot to the very last episode. And I was like, okay, so what is ever going to happen with this show? Well, I guess it ended up getting canceled. And so, during that time, never really understood the whole thing of, did it come on a different night? Was it, because, the OC was like that too, where eventually it seemed that the OC continued on and I didn't realize. So I caught up years later when eventually you have this thing called money at some point, right? Or eventually you have a convenient way to find it, which is very much more or much less rare nowadays. So, Reaper, one, where can you go and find this show? Because it might be severely hard. Well, first off, there's this thing, I guess you can go into abc.com, or ABC should probably have an app somehow where you can eventually access this show and watch episodes if that's what you want to do, especially if it's to be on Google and tell you to do that. You can go ahead and do that. There are also other apps that I've been there, in fact, using for a while. You can go into Fox HD Movies. You can Google also an app called Letter C Movies and probably see Reaper for absolutely free. Like ABC, there isn't a fee to go into that either, but whatever you want to do. So yeah, you can search Fox HD Movies on Google Play, and you can go out of your way to find a logo that says so. But the title will be something different of this app. But you'll be able to download that app and be able to watch whatever for free. So anyways, pushing on. So what is this show about? So this show is, of course, kind of like the pilot sets up the whole premise of the show in a nice fell swoop. So what ends up happening is we have a guy named Sam who ends up turning 21 on his 21st. I'm like, why wouldn't he go after him when he's 18? He's an adult legal. Why wait till 21? That just seems so absurd. Did they just really want bar sequences in this movie, or in this show? I mean, because it's a show, because it's season 1. I don't know. I don't know why 21. But anyways, so Sam is to be told by his parents that unfortunately, his parents had sold his soul to the devil, because evidently Mr. Oliver was evidently in poor health, so they sold their soul so that way he could get better. And the whole thing of it is that the devil is to be like, well, I'm gonna give you this, but you have to give me the soul of your second child. Well, during that time, they didn't have a second child until coincidentally they end up getting another baby out. And so, yeah. So, now, forcibly, the devil is to magically appear in front of Sam and tell him that he's going to be the bounty hunter for the devil, which is him. So, Sam is not having the best of birthdays, and so reasonably he's going to find out that every single day is just this arduous process to get all these souls collected. And within these 2 episodes, we, especially in this pilot, get a really good showcasing of what's to behold. And then it seems like there's a pretty good pattern of demonish, monsterish, whatever-ish things. And also kind of these fun banter of the show. Fairly enjoyable. I really liked it. So let's go ahead and do this thing called a double 5 time territory, because I think it's just going into spoilers. Really, it ties into people that have probably ever worked a retail job in their life, because a lot of times you would go into a retail job, and a lot of the experiences that you probably see on the show you would also kind of see here, or like every once, like, so it seems like some of this stuff is actually accurate. And plus also they basically call retail HELL, which I can really, from my own personal experience, say roughly this could be accurate or quite possibly inaccurate. So that way, if for any reason that I need to eventually, like, because I guess realizing that somewhere down the road, uh, the wheels aren't going to keep spinning forever. So, going into this, let's go out of our way to say that it's that customary double five time territory, and let's get into spoilers about the show. I like this show. I would not be randomly reviewing it if I wasn't to have really already have spoken in utter breath about Reaper and how enjoyable this show was. So definitely go and check it out. Interestingly enough, the guy who ends up playing Sock on this show, Tyler Labine, actually is on a Hulu show called Deadbeat, and like this may be similar to that show also. And if you don't want to like go out of your way to find Reaper, go and find Deadbeat. Deadbeat is actually a fun like Sixth Sense kind of a show, but it's also raunchy and has like some interesting comedic things. I've seen the whole first season of that, and like eventually I was going to possibly re-review it, but I don't know. I don't know. We'll see about it. So with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time you spoil this episode. So check this out, please, won't you? So Sam is to, of course, wake up in the beginning of this episode. Here's the weird thing. So why would anybody have their own name in their room? Like, weirdly, we have this room that has to say the word Sam on it. Like, I think for me, there were times where, like, my parents wanted me to, like, have J's and G's and maybe other kinds of letters that represent my name. And I'm like, no, not in my room. Like, I don't care for that stuff. Plus, also, like, I didn't really care for much of, like, oh, let's have family pictures in your room. I'm like, no, like, I don't care for that. Like if anything, I'll just have some, like, wall decals or whatever. But anyways, pushing on. Sam wakes up, puts his little work get up on, because really, this is all this guy really does. Because sadly enough, he didn't go to college because supposedly college makes him sleepy. So Sam goes off to go and greet his parents. His parents are like, oh, hey, happy birthday there, sport. And so, not really exactly telling him that, hey, just so you know, like, your soul has been sold to the devil. So, but eventually they have to tell him later on. So, Sam all of a sudden is to go to his work like every day is normal. And so Sam is to go and grab this cart that's kind of in the parking lot. And all of a sudden, like, the cart kind of like pushes away from where Sam is. It kind of feels like a magnet kind of thing. Where all of a sudden, like, the cart doesn't want to get into Sam's hands. So all of a sudden, Sam goes to work. And so immediately we have his boss, who is Ted, who I guess is probably, like, I guess he's probably the only manager here, which I'm like, okay, so is he the GM? Is he, like, I guess they just have one manager. They don't have a separation of certain kind of, like, managers or whatever. Like, I know for a lot of retail, they would have this breakdown of, like, certain departments would have certain managers, or certain sides of the store would have a certain manager. to eventually, like, every single time, if you're a lower person on the totem pole, because you don't have much of a real true title, you can just be like, oh, well, hey, I'll just direct you right to this manager who's going to deal with that, because hence why he gets paid the supposed big bucks, right? Which isn't really true. Yeah, neither is anybody else that kind of gets a title, and it's like, well, that's why you get paid the big bucks. Yeah, like, dude, I probably get paid like maybe 50 cents more than you do, like, or just like really, like, it's kind of funny whenever I was to get a higher position in retail or whichever, like, basically the pay never changed. They're just like, oh, well, you get this title now. I'm like, so I get more responsibility, but I don't get paid more? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. But that's how it worked for them all the time. But that's me being still a bitter bitty. But whatever, boo-hoo, I'm gonna cry a river. Anyways, pushing on. So so Sam goes into the meeting where we have this, I guess, GM who is to be Ted, who is to kind of break down that, I guess, their sales are kind of doing well, but it seems that Bert had decided to just go and not do much of a single sale, and Bert is like, well, like, just wait, I'm gonna pounce like a snake. Like, you're gonna see me just making some huge sales, like, believe me. And Ted's not believing Bert whatsoever, or Sock, as I would probably much rather call him, because I know him as Sock much more than Bert, weirdly. So all of a sudden Sam comes in, and so everybody's like, hey, happy birthday. And so Andy, who is seemingly this girl that is like the will they won't they between Sam and Andy, because they play around with that a lot, and then eventually Sam seems to eventually start going out with a girl. Andy starts going out with somebody. But it's like the consistent will they won't they for the longest time. And so, anyways, pushing on. So Andy is to really just be Sam's friend and is to give him this gift, but he can't open it right now because because Andy has gift giving anxiety. I would have just been like, well, I'm going to open this right now. I don't give a about your anxiety. I'm going to open this right now. And I'm just like, this is great. Who cares? Like, gift giving anxiety. Then, like, don't even have given it to me. Just, like, sweep it under the rug or something. Or just, I don't know. You could have given it to somebody else, and then that person could have given it to him, and that would have worked out, because I've had plenty of times where I think that has happened, where the actual person didn't want to give me the gift. It was actually somebody else. And then I was like, what the F is this? Like, I think there was one time in high school where there was some girl that wanted to give me some note, but then, like, I was trying to understand the note, but I was like, okay, so what is this? Like, the person didn't even, like, give me, like, a thing about the note. So I was just like, whatever, like, whatever was this? Toss it in the trash, because, like, I don't know what the heck this was. But anyways, again, moot point. Why do I have so many personal stuff that I have to blab in here? Like, my life has just been a champion of an existence. But F it. So Sam is to eventually go and start doing his job, which I like. It seems like they shift these people around way too often. Like, I'm sorry if in 2 episodes we've had Sam do a number of different kind of departments. It seems like he was doing like electronics. He was like turning on all the TVs for that day. And then all of a sudden in another segment he's like he's doing lawn and garden. In another segment he's he's doing cart duty. In another segment he's doing overnights where he's doing inventory counting. And I'm like, man, in 2 episodes, this like this guy's shift changes wildly too often, and that makes no sense to me, especially if you were to really look at normal retail. Like, this store must be like crazily staffed to where like these people's schedule can be ridiculously adjusted. I don't get that at all. Because you would never do that in retail, like shift someone's schedule so often they would quit. Like they would just be like, I'm sorry, like I need like a day ahead notice of what my schedule is, because like a lot of people would eventually just like, yeah, because a lot of retail points like more recently would just be like, hey, you're on call. Like basically you don't really have a schedule. You're just like a doctor that it's like, oh, hey, do you want to come in like tomorrow or like an hour from now? And then you're just like, well, no, couldn't you have actually have called me like at a reasonable time instead of the day up? And they're like, well, we need people. Whatever. I'm B-wording and moaning, and I didn't want to do that. But again, the retail thing of things, like I'm trying to have insight about stuff. Maybe someone has never worked a retail day in their life, or maybe they have for years, and it's just irritated the crap out of them too. So, hence why not watch a retail show? That makes sense, right? I might as well watch, what is that, Superstore? That stupid show about retail, which made no sense to me. As I was trying to watch this show, well, I wasn't watching this show, someone else was watching, and I'm like, why are you watching this? It's horrible. So what ends up happening is Andy is to go on and have this forklift, I guess, be lifting these things way up in the sky for whatever reason. And so all of a sudden Sam was on this TV watching these TVs that all of a sudden had these flames that are to be appearing all over the TVs. And all of a sudden Ted is to bump into Sam and be like, hey, hey, get to your job. Like, I've seen a lot of managers kind of do that where it's like, hey, like if I snap, you come here. And I'm like, whatever. Like, you guys don't pay me enough. You don't. Sock eventually is to appear, and Sam is to mention about this creepy show that he was watching, and Bert is to look and say like, oh, chickens, yeah, or chicks, yeah, that's really horrifying. So all of a sudden Sam is to eventually turn to see that this forklift is going to go and topple over. Some product is going to fall off this forklift. Not the forklift is toppling over, completely different thing. So Sam goes and is to dive to try to save Andy from having this product fall onto her. And so the product ends up going flying without Andy actually touching it. And then Andy goes flying into this end cap aisle of tissue paper. Luckily for him, right? So all of a sudden now Sam and Sock are having a private moment where Sam is to mention that he can now move things with his mind. And so that gives Sock the perfect opportunity to take some random item and smack Sam with that. And he's like, God, like, he's like, I don't know, like, I guess I can't control it. So, so Sam ends up getting hit with things repetitiously by Sock to see if, like, this will eventually kick in these powers that Sam, of course, is to have. So, uh, so eventually, Sam is to see Andy again, and so Andy is like, oh, because there's a bump on Sam's head, and she's like, oh, well, is that because of what you did? And Sam is like, well, no, like, if anything, like, that was just Sock who ended up lobbing me in the head with something. And so Andy ends up giving Sam an instant ice pack, and so she ends up kind of talking to him. So uh, Andy is eventually gonna go with Sam to this bar and say like, "Oh yeah, you're gonna be hurting. Like you better have tomorrow off because like yeah, you're really gonna feel bad. You're gonna like be hungover. Like there's no tomorrow." Like for me, I would have like I love taking like vacation time off like right around the time that um that it's my birthday. But like weirdly, once I was like starting to go and do like later on into certain kind of jobs, all of a sudden, coincidentally, they weirdly couldn't give me that time off. And I was like, well, I would really love that time off because it's the only time where I'm like take time off of the whole entire year. And they're like, well, it's coinciding with a holiday. I'm like, I don't care. How many days do I take off in any part of the year? I'm like, okay, so I'm willing to work during certain parts of that week, but how about you give me one day off? And they're like, well, I'm like, wow, okay. Hence why frustrations build every once in a while. So, but again, why am I saying so many personal things? It's I think this is bringing up way too many bad things, but oh well. Maybe no one will care about this review. No one will be interested in it, and then everyone will just be like, "Why is he boohooing, crying, bitter, b word, whatever?" Anyways, pushing on. So Sam is to eventually decide because also when Sam is to be with Andy, all of a sudden he's getting attacked by dogs. Weirdly, there's a whole aisle that is to all of a sudden just have dogs now for whatever reason, and so Sam is just losing his freaking mind because there's a batch of dogs that all of a sudden appear out of nowhere. And so Sam is now running away from these dogs to all of a sudden have Sock have this blower just kind of push these dogs away for whatever weird reason. I'm like, was there like a dog teaching thing that went horribly awry in the store? Is there a pet store in part of this thing? Is there like a Petco attached to this thing? Or a pet company attached to this store? I'm so confused. So, uh, so eventually Sam has had enough and he is to tell one of his other coworkers, which I'm hoping it's the HR person, because that would not make sense otherwise. The human resource person. I guess I should have actually said what that was. So Sam goes and walks off the job and punches out. Like, uh, again, that doesn't seem quite accurate to me, but I'm nitpicking. So Sam goes home and is to tell his father, you know what, I think I'm losing my mind. There's a lot of things that aren't going quite right today. Because eventually, when Sam is to come home, all of a sudden the devil appears into his back seat, and so Sam is just like, "Oh my God, are you a carjacker?" And the devil's like, "No, I'm the devil." And so all of a sudden, Sam crashes his car into some huge uh, dumpster, and so then he gets out of his car, opens the door of his backseat to realize the devil is weirdly gone. So Sam makes it home, and so Sam is to tell his father that he's losing his mind, and so Mr. Oliver is now having to sit Sam down and is to mention, like, hey man, I want to finally tell you something that we should have probably told you a long time ago. Well, turns out Mr. Oliver was sick, and so, like, we basically have already set up this story. Eventually, this doctor was supposedly tell Mr. Oliver a little white lie that he can't have children, but he actually can. So goes Sam, and he's born, and so now he's just forced to be the bounty hunter. They try to avoid, of course, having Sam, but it was an unavoidable thing. So reasonably, like, they're like, his parents just kind of feel so mortified about all of this. But again, there's nothing really for them to that they can just do. Like, this deal has already been made. So Sam is to eventually go off and all of a sudden just be hearing this one door that is to be in his house kind of having this weird music and this white light. So Sam starts walking and opening this door to find out that it's weirdly some hockey rink, where inside of it is to be a guy on some Zamboni who is just kind of, I guess, wetting down the ice. I'm like, I'm sorry, but if we had a guy in there with a Zamboni, why is there hockey music going on? Are they testing the music to make sure it works? I guess you can rationalize that. So Sam all of a sudden is going and talking to the devil, and really just Sam is to mention, it's like, well, I don't think I can do this, it's too hard, like, and so the devil is just like, well, hey, like that's all that you've ever done. Like, you're a quitter. Like, all you've ever done is quit, and I will not accept like a loss. Like, I will not, like, basically the devil is saying that he won't take no for an answer, that like Sam will not be able to do this. So now the devil is to go and give Sam this goofy looking box that is to supposedly have his weapon to go up against this this devil of a person who is to supposedly be this firefighter. Oh, coincidentally, this, if I didn't say this before, the pilot episode is actually directed by Kevin Smith, of course. A lot of people know him as Silent Bob or whichever, but anyways, Silent Bob or just straight up Kevin Smith because he's pretty popular. Anyways, so so we find out that in this box is to be this dirt devil, and they're like, okay, like, what is this dirt devil going to do? And so Sam turns it on and realizes that the suction of this vacuum is absurdly high compared to probably others. So it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I just suck him in. So this this soul that Sam is to collect is to be this firefighter guy that coincidentally used to start flames when he was not this person before. And so he was an arsonist before, but now he's a volunteer firefighter, which is kind of an ironic twist or an oxymoron kind of thing. So, or an onomatopoeia, or however you want to pronounce that. Anyways, so eventually, like, it's funny when going into IMDb because they just call him the fireman. Son of a bitch. You couldn't have actually had the guy's name in the thing. Like, I'm sure he probably had a name in the thing, but whatever. Like, I think his name is Smecker. Luckily I remember that, because that sucks that they didn't actually have the actual name of this person. So yeah, so what ends up happening is that so I want to get this like perfectly down and just kind of remember everything. So what ends up happening is we have Sam, Bert, and Ben, who we just kind of like lump Ben together into this group of friends. Uh, like at first, but then it seems like they actually are really good friends and they do hang out with one another. And I'm like, oh, okay, so they're justifying like the three of them together because it just seemed like Bert and Sock for the longest time. And it seemed like Bert and Sock would just have these kind of conversations, and then kind of Ben would like randomly come in there every once in a while. But like to me, honestly, but it seemed like they really integrated this guy into these three of people, and it seems that every time, like especially after the pilot, that Ben is to go and help Sam do these kinds of things. So, anyways, plus eventually Ben has an interesting side story too. Eventually he is to go and get a unique girlfriend somewhere in the show. Let's just mention that. So, so Sam is to eventually go with Ben and Bert to go and try to take down this Schmecker. And so they go out, and Sam tries to use the vacuum to go after this fireman, but eventually we find out that the firemen, they get caught off guard by him because he has this flame like power, and they didn't realize that because they've never seen a soul before. And so what eventually ends up happening is Ben ends up getting hurt, and so all three of the guys end up just running for it. Like, so it's kind of like the real Ghostbusters scenario, where if things don't go like easily, quickly, and smoothly and whatever, they decide to just make a run for it to just go uh, into figuring out what to do the second time around. We're gonna see there's a lot of times with his character. Eventually, Sam is going to fail a lot, but then eventually he's going to have some grandmaster plan to eventually kind of figure this out, or eventually he'll just get lucky. So they run off, and so Sam is running off to the hospital. Andy comes to the hospital and is like, "Hey, what happened?" And so Sam just says, "It's like, well, hey, it's my fault that he ended up getting injured." So so eventually, what ends up happening is both Bert and Sam go off, and I think about around this time they are to do like, I want to say that they're doing overnights, like they're forcibly doing overnights. Uh, like if they aren't doing like cart duty or whatever, where that doesn't last all that long. Uh, because eventually Sam was to eventually mix it up with Andy. Or no, wait, let's like I'm speeding through this. Let's go to the birthday stuff, cuz Sam eventually is to go on and uh to go to this bar and get a bunch of drinks. And so Sam goes off to eventually just chug all these drinks, and that's when he ends up telling Bert that he is a bounty hunter for the devil. And he tells him into the bathroom without the rest of his friends. So Sam ends up bailing out of this bar to go home because he's not supposedly feeling well. And so, like, weirdly, we have like Sock, who's to mention that like Sam is like Linda Blair, and like if he can turn his head all the way around. And Sam like, no, like I'm not like a possessed person, like I'm just some bounty hunter. So so yeah, so eventually what ends up happening is Sam is to eventually go and supposedly do cart duty, and Andy is to be excited about that because that's her favorite job, because she has figured out how to rig the system where she can just go and see a movie and whatever and still get paid, because she's supposedly shifting or sifting or going and whatever and trying to find carts or she has supposedly carts specifically at certain kind of locations and whatever. Anyways, so but then Andy ends up getting hot water with Ted, to where eventually it pushes him on to do overnights, as well as Sock ends up getting in trouble. So now Sam is ticked at Sock about the whole overnights thing, but eventually it's to kind of just help them eventually just decide, while they're doing inventory, like they just kind of do some random numbers and just like, F it, which they shouldn't have done. And they also end up going off to try and take down Evil. So instead of working, let me pause here for 1 second. All right. So Sam is to, this time around with Sock, come more prepared. And so all of a sudden they're just basically putting on these like onesies that are like construction onesies. And all of a sudden they're like decking themselves out with like fire alarms and like everything like fire related. Fire extinguishers, hoses, all kinds of stuff. And Sam is to realize that supposedly the Dirt Devil has lost charge. And so now they're rushing to the Isle of Witch where this Dirt Devil is to be held, so that way they can get a charger from one of the boxes and charge this up. So now they go off and they fight Schmecker, because they ended up going and finding out exactly where this fireman was going to strike next, because they ended up going to Josie's office, which Josie is some kind of lawyer that was to have been formerly in love with Sock, but they ended up breaking up. And now it's just this like back and forth, kind of also will they, won't they with them. But this girl has no interest in getting back with Sock. But there's always these jokes between these two about whether they or will they or won't they or whichever. So, pushing on. So Sam goes and researches this whole arsonist, and eventually finds out certain buildings that he had burnt down. Because Sam makes the thought process that maybe this arsonist is to go and burn down the same buildings over and over and over again whenever they rebuild them, just because he hates these specific buildings. And so, figuring that out, so they triangulate and figure out that this building has consistently gotten burnt down. So they go to that building, and coincidentally, the arsonist is to be there. So they had this like rooftop battle where eventually they use these fire extinguishers and kind of spray Schmecker pretty good and kind of get him caught off guard. And they're like, yeah, we did it. It's like, dude, you didn't capture the guy yet. So all of a sudden, the arsonist ends up striking back, grabbing Sam, chucking him, going and kind of leaving Sock to just kind of fend for himself. So all of a sudden, these flames are all of a sudden almost going to get to Sock, and so Sam is using his Force Jedi-like power to eventually combine this whole flame that this arsonist had to go collect it into a ball and hit the arsonist with it, which knocks him back into this one part of this building. But then all of a sudden we have this like Ghostbusters moment. Like, if people remember the ending of Ghostbusters, where we have the woman who is to jump from one part of the thing to the other, while the Ghostbusters kind of like looking as this woman is to eventually jump. And so that's, of course, when they end up using the proton packs on her and kind of supposedly neutralize her, but that's not true. It just ushers in Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and so on and so forth. So, like, that kind of moment. So, all of a sudden, Sam whips out the dirt devil, and sucks this demon in. And they're like, yeah, we did it. And so now they have to forcibly go to the DMV, because this is a place for them to deposit uh, the soul weapon thing. And so, God, what is her name? Claudia? Claddy? Good grief. Or Gladys? What a goofy name. Anyways, so eventually they teleport the demon soul thing, and so the DMV demon is to basically tell these guys, it's like, well, hey, yeah, like, never seen this kind of weapon used before. Like, I guess you guys must really suck at what you're doing. So, eventually, now that they've had this great la-di-da like win, eventually what ends up happening is, at some point in this episode, the devil had like bought a bunch of crap and put it onto Sam's kind of credit, so he's eventually going to get whatever this ham thing is that they're kind of really wanting to win for. And so Sam ends up winning this ham, and he's like, you know what? Like, this ham really feels good. It feels like a real victory ham kind of thing. So they're like, hey man, you know what? Maybe we can do this. Like, maybe like we can go on and really just do this job. So, ushering in the now second episode. So, the second episode is to eventually, I think, tie a little bit more with Andy, where it seems that eventually Andy is to start to get in trouble and to try to eventually get like the same kind of job as Sam. But then eventually Ted starts to realize that, and he's like, oh no, like, I'm not going to have you guys both work together. Like, it's not going to happen, so you old buddies or cronies or whatever can just kind of slack off. No. So the next episode is to start off with Sam getting this new box for this soul collector thing. And he's like, you know what, it's way too early to open up this box. But the thing continues to follow him. And I think in the second episode, that's where Bert is to, I think, mention... no, I don't know, and pushing on. So Sock is to mention, like, hey, could I open up the box? And Sam is like, well, no, like, it's not with me because I left it at home. And Sock is like, well, no, it's right behind us. So Sam looks behind him to realize the box is still there, and he's like, oh my god, this box is like stalking me. Like, I'm not going to get rid of it until I open it. Like, it gets to the point where he ends up, like, tripping on it at one point, and it looks hilarious. So it seems that whenever, like, Sam is to try to get rid of this, because what Sock does is Sock has a plan where he takes this box and puts it in the middle of the forest somewhere, and then runs off with Sam to eventually get in the car and drive off to work. And immediately once they open the door to get to work, Sam trips over the box again, and Sock is like, oh my god, could we do that again? Like, that's hilarious. So eventually Sam opens the box because it won't stop, like, following him until he does. So Sam is to find out that it's to be this this kind of little car with this remote control to just kind of, like, control the car. And so they're like, okay, this seems weird. So, and the thing that I forgot about is the devil is to kind of lay the groundwork of us kind of understanding this character, this soul. But then eventually Sam has to go even further to do even more research about this soul to kind of figure out how he can eventually capture him somehow. So in the first pilot episode, the devil is to kind of show Sam where he is to be located. Uh, but then when like Sam fails at that, like the devil's like, well, that's because you didn't do enough research on this guy. You got to figure out who he really is, and you got to really find out like how to quickly and easily get to him. So Sam now in episode 2 is to have this static shock problem where seemingly when Sock is to just like, hey, what's going on with your neck? And so all of a sudden Sock kind of touches Sam on the neck and gets shocked. And Bert just keeps poking at him and poking at him, continues to shock him. And Sam gets really annoyed. So we go off, and there's to be this one spot where Andy is to be $8 short of her register, and she had counted numerous times. And so Ted is like, well, okay, well, I guess you're going to be in the doghouse, Andy. Like, one more insult, and I'm just going to have you go and switch doing overnights. And Andy's like, yeah, I'm going to do that, definitely. So Andy goes on and is to tell Ted, it's like, well, yeah, I stole the $8 so I could buy you a blow-up doll. Like, it's a plastic variety good. So Ted's like, wait a minute. Like, I know that you're just trying to get into the same kind of department as this guy is. Like, no, it's not going to work that easily. And so Ted walks off, and so Andy's like, well, I tried, and Sam was like, oh, well. So what eventually happens is that the guys, instead of course, doing their job, here's the goofy thing. For a retail store and an overnight like people, I would not think you would be able to get out of the store during overnights. Like, if anything, because I've had like I've seen where like if people were to try to leave the store during a certain part of night because they had to, eventually alarms would be set off, like police would be called, all kinds of things. And like, and managers and stuff will complain because it's like, oh, well, that costs some money to eventually like have like an alarm system be triggered and police being called. That costs something. And I'm like, well, what if you forgot your like what if you what if any number of scenarios happened where you like, what if the store was on fire? I don't know. But anyways, like that would ever happen. But I guess police would be called, and that would be a reasonable thing to have just fire department there. Anyways, so because I think I opened a door by accident, like because it was like from a part of a department, so I didn't think there would be any problems because they told me to go into that room, and so I did. And then I ended up finding out that it's like, oh, well, you set off some alarm. I'm like, I didn't know. Like, there was no sound. Alarm didn't go off. But anyways, so what ends up happening is that pushing on. So Sam is to eventually Sam is. I have a baffling moment here. So they unbox the thing. They find out it's a race car with the remote, and I'm trying to figure out how to get back in here, get back into the game. So Sam goes off and is to get out of the store, because what ends up happening is we continue to have these blackouts that keep emerging on the town, and supposedly for every time a blackout is to happen or there's to be some kind of electricity surge, it's to be our villain of this episode going and actually killing people, who is Arthur Ferry. So they have the name for this guy in IMDb, but in the other episode, they just call him the Fireman, because I guess they're just lazy. But maybe they looked at the credits at whichever, and they're just like, oh, well, we'll just call him the Fireman. Anyways, so eventually, the devil is to tell Sam about Arthur Ferry, and that he is consistently killing people, and so Sam really needs to hurry up and kind of solve this whole case, or otherwise people are going to be dying every single day. And so Sam is to go to this spot to give this hospital these generators because they keep losing power. And so Ted was going to go off and do it, but the guys are like, oh no, we'll go off and we'll do it. And supposedly these people had paid like twice what they were worth. I'm like, I'm sorry, but like if this is like, unless it's like this is a weird kind of retailish thing, there's no way that would happen. Like if this is like a corporate chain thing of a store, there's no way you can just kind of like jack up the price of something like twice. Like I can see you discounting it or whatever, but not jacking up the price unless you're just to like ring things up that aren't actually there and just give that to a person. Like eventually someone would ask for a receipt, and yeah, so there'd be a lot of problems with that. Like I could see like somebody returning those items and eventually just getting their money back and just getting a cheaper generator. But anyways, so what ends up happening is that the guys end up going to this hospital, and so it seems that Sam is to figure out, I guess, that Arthur had struck this hospital, hence why their power went out. So eventually they give them this generator, and all of a sudden Sam is to realize that Arthur had struck a specific spot of this hospital, and so Sam is like, hey, what is this writing that has kind of been hidden behind here? And so all of a sudden Sam touches it, and he ends up getting electrified, and he ends up getting like freaking shot back. You would think in this case that at some point like a strand of Sam's hair would possibly turn white, or any kind of goofy stories that we've ever heard about someone getting electrified. But maybe that doesn't happen to everyone. But like we get the goofy thing of just Sam having this like kind of really staticky hair. So Sam is to eventually go to this bar shortly thereafter this, and they're drinking, and all of a sudden Sam is like, hey, there's something about that sign that Arthur wanted to take down. And so now I have to, like, now he wants to figure out what the connection is. So Arthur is to borrow this girl's phone, and she says no, but then Ben asks, and she's like, okay, sure. Like, Ben, slap the digits, buddy. Give her the digits. She needs your numbers. Give her the sweet, sweet numberunos. Anyways, pushing on. I'm joking with this. So Sam uses it, and then he's like, okay, like, I figured it out that supposedly Arthur had donated a bunch of money to these buildings, and so a lot of these buildings named the building after him, but they ended up finding out that Arthur was to also do these like horrible things like cut funding or like so he was to donate to things to eventually just kind of like sabotage these buildings also. So and eventually he like went to prison, I think, for like fraud or something like that. So eventually people just were like, F it, we're just gonna rename this thing then. And so Arthur came back and he was just really upset about that. And so he's going and taking down the same uh, things that he's ever like donated money to. So eventually Sam is to figure that out. And so while like it seems that Sock is kind of messing around with this little car remote control dealy where he's just like, yeah, like he does the goofy little Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. Uh, we'll give you the seat, but all you're gonna need is the edge. Like whatever. So, so they end up figuring out that there seems to be another shortage, and it's weirdly by the dam. And so now Ben is telling all the guys, well, hey, how about we go to Sporting Goods? And we end up getting these wetsuits. I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense because they'll be like there'll be a hindrance of being electrified. That's kind of smart. So they go onto the dam, and supposedly, like Arthur is gearing up to eventually take down this whole dam. I guess is his plan. You know what I see? You know what I see? What I did with there? Sand. I can't even talk. Anyways, so Sam is to just be like, okay, we need to do this. We're gonna do this. So Sam just like shows up and is like, Arthur, do you want to do this the easy way or the hard way? And so all of a sudden Sam is to take this little robot and try to drive it into this guy, and all of a sudden like a truck just runs this remote control car thing over, and he's like, oh crap, what do I do now? Not realizing that the remote was actually the key to this whole thing. And so now they're weirdly trying to like duct tape this thing together and all kinds of stuff, thinking that it's still the car, but it's the remote, and eventually Sam realizes that. So Arthur eventually vanishes, and eventually the devil is to tell Sam later on, it's like, well, hey, like, now, this time around, like, this soul knows you're coming after him, so now he's gonna come after you. So, usher in yet another night where Sam is doing some overnights, and so Arthur is going and messing with the electricity of this store called the Workbench, where all of a sudden we have all the kind of tool appliances all of a sudden are absurdly on for whatever reason, and they're all just kind of gee-dunking and whatever. And so all of a sudden these guys are now like running through this whole entire store because the store is trying to attack them. Like nail guns are firing off. I'm like, why would there be actual nail guns in the nail guns? Why? Like, I'm sorry. That feels like a lawsuit waiting to happen. As well as any number of these items that are to be plugged in, that are seemingly dangerous, that at any point in any time, someone could accidentally cut their finger off. Like, you would think they would have some kind of, like, plastic thing there instead of an actual blade, or there not being a blade on that thing, or that thing not being plugged in. That just seems like a lawsuit waiting to happen. But I guess that's just me, right? So... Oh, the reason why Sam and Sock had to forcibly do overnights anyways is because Sock was chucking up these oil containers to Sam, and Sam wasn't paying attention to Sock because Sam was paying attention to the devil, saying like, hey, get that soul. And so all of a sudden, like, one of the oil containers go flying, because you shouldn't be tossing things up to somebody anyways. That just is stupid. And so somebody in the other aisle gets on the head. And so, like, Ted is like, hey, a bloody customer is not a happy customer. And so they end up getting ushered into overnights. That's how it all started off. That's how it all began. So, but back to our regularly scheduled episode. So, the guys are running around. Ben is to consistently get hurt from whatever ghost, seemingly for these 2 episodes. Because, of course, Ben ended up getting, like, burnt in the first episode. Now, all of a sudden, he ends up getting a nail lodged into his leg. And so, eventually, Sam is to put upon himself. It's like, you know what, I gotta do this by myself. I gotta go out there and face this thing. And so here's also the thing. So Mr. Oliver gave, coincidentally, Sam this hybrid car that's, of course, electrical. So it's like, oh, okay. So it kind of works into the theme of this episode. And because the hybrid car eventually, like, has this, like, Christine moment where it's kind of out in the parking lot, eventually just kind of, like, forcing these guys to stay within the store, for eventually the store to just eventually, I guess, try and kill these people. So, Sam is to go off on his own. We also have Sam who's avoiding to tell his mother that he's the devil's bounty hunter. But by the end of this episode, he ends up confessing to her, and she's like, well, at least you told me the truth. So it seems that also the hybrid car also ends up getting wrecked in this episode, and so Sam's brother was like, hey, 2 cars he's wrecked now? Like, why you keep giving him cars? Because he's a devil's bounty hunter, that's why. But anyways, so Sam goes off into the parking lot, and now Arthur Curry's to finally appear to just mention, it's like, well, hey, like, you're never taking me back. Like, I need to seek vengeance on all these people that have renamed things and forgotten about me, and they need to remember, kind of thing. So Sam ends up whipping out the antenna that is on this remote and sucking Arthur Ferry in that way. Or is it? It's Ferry? Ferry. And sucking him in that way. So it's like, yeah, another thing down. So they end up turning this thing into the DMV, and so they only have the remote, and the DMV woman's like, well, hey, you don't have the whole thing here. And so they end up just chucking pieces on her counter of all the, like, the car pieces. And so she's like, well, good enough. So within the end of this last episode, Ted was still just not having Sam really win him over. So Ted is just like, well, hey, like, you're now going from overnights to now, like, garbage duty, because you really need to learn a lesson. So Sam is going and picking up garbage, and it's the worst possible job. Like, I've had those kind of jobs where you're picking up cigarette butts, and I'm like, I'm like, no, like, give me a stick or give me, like, gloves or something. They didn't have gloves. Like, I'm like, I don't want to touch anything that anyone's touched, especially if someone's lips have been on it. But yeah, there would just be a number of people that would just, like, take an entire parking lot and making it their own personal ashtray. So it would just be like, oh my god. So I have never seen so many cigarette butts in my life. So just stacking them up, making them a filter like in the movie Biodome with Stephen Baldwin. So now, good God, I've spoken for almost an hour. Good grief. So the end of this is that the devil is to eventually change Ted's shifts, and to now give Sam, instead of going and doing this whole garbage pickup. He's now being in lawn and garden, or the garden section, and Sam is like, "Oh, great! Now I have to go and shovel manure and fertilizer, because I guess like manure and fertilizer are technically one and the same, but still." So all of a sudden, Sam goes in the lawn and garden section, and so all of a sudden he's to just stack all these things of fertilizer, which is like, oh my god, that must be a hard, arduous process. I did that all the time. Like, not only that, but it would always be like water softener bags, which are like 40-pound bags, which are actually probably the heaviest freaking things to just log up, or just toss up into your like shoulder and drag those things out because they freaking are heavy. So he didn't get to do that job, but even with that, like, probably those actual fertilizer bags probably weren't that heavy. There was probably like they were probably chintzy looking bags or whatever. Like, oh well, because hey, you don't want to throw an actor's back out, because if they would have, like, dude, I am freaking done with this job. Like, you guys can get somebody else to replace. You guys can recast this role, right? So all of a sudden, Sam is to realize, and here's how we'll end the episode in review. Sam is to realize that Andy is to be in this lawn and garden, and so Andy's like, well, hey, like, I guess we're in hell together, right? And Sam is just like, what now? See, what now? And it's like, yeah, like, technically this is like a form of hell, and so really just Sam was like, well, yeah, I guess we are technically in the same department. And you would have thought that Andy would have finally asked her out, because eventually there was to be a spot where Andy was to like almost ask Andy out, because he's kind of like, hey, what are you doing on Saturday? And she's like, oh, I'm doing nothing. I'm just doing a report, like a dorky dork. And you would have thought that like Sam would have came up with something cool, like, hey, well, how about we do something together? But then he ended up saying like, well, yeah, I'm not doing anything either, too, playing games and whatever. But like Andy just walks off, and then like Sam is just like, shoot me or punch me really hard in the face, Ben. Um, so yeah, so the devil technically did one good thing for uh, for Sam, and at certain points, like, the devil does technically, in some way or another, do a good thing for Sam, but then oftentimes he tries to take things away also, uh, because his devil catching thing comes first. So, or his demon catching thing comes first. So, with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Yeah, I thought I had something in rebuttal or something to say here. These episodes might have not perfectly come out perfectly. That's bound to happen. If there's any details that I forgot about, if there's anything that I slipped or tripped and blipped about, I apologize, but otherwise, I always like to see that to protect myself. And there always might be a rebuttal if another one of these gets reviewed, of me just going, oh yeah, I forgot about this one moment. And that's bound to happen. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.